All right, ready to dive into something that might seem kind of basic at first, but trust me, this is going to get pretty deep, pretty fast. Relative identity. It's like we usually assume things just are what they are, right? One single definite thing. But philosophy loves to mess with those assumptions.
It really does. And the source we're looking at today, an article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, goes right to the heart of this idea of relative identity. Can things be the same in one way, but different in another? It sounds kind of paradoxical, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
So to start, let's just make sure we're all clear on like what we usually mean when we talk about identity. You know, the basics.
Right. The standard account of identity basically says that a thing is only identical to itself. Like it's a very self-contained kind of relationship.
So we're talking about what's often called absolute identity.
Exactly. But even with that standard account, things can get a little tricky because to say something is identical to itself, we kind of have to already understand what it means for something to be different from something else. You see the circularity there.
I think so. It's like we need to define other before we can define self, right?
Precisely. And that's one of the points that relative identity theorists often bring up. They argue that things can be the same in one way, but different in another.
And the source uses a really interesting example to illustrate this. A single person being counted as two different passengers on a plane.
Right. Like if absolute identity is true, meaning things are only ever identical to themselves, then how can one person be two different things? Seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, it really throws a wrench in that simple idea of one thing.
Hmm.
So how does relative identity try to resolve this?
Well, it gets us thinking about the specific ways in which things are the same or different. In that passenger example, the person is the same person, but their role as a passenger is different for each flight.
So are we saying there are actually two of that person on the plane? That sounds a little wild.
Not exactly. What the source says is that those two passengers are different Gs, meaning they're both of the kind passenger, but they're not the same passenger.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction. It's like they're of that kind passenger, but not the same instance of that kind.
Exactly. It's a subtle but crucial point. And it's really at the core of what relative identity is all about. That identity can depend on the context, on how we're categorizing things.
So how does this concept of relative identity actually challenge the standard account? It seems like they could both be true.
Well, the conflict comes in when you bring in Leibniz's law. That's a key principle in logic.
Right, Leibniz's law.
Mm.
It states that if two things are truly identical, then they must share all the same properties.
Exactly. And that's where the friction with relative identity comes in. Because if everything has to have all the same properties to be considered identical, well, then this idea of something being the same in one way but different in another, it kind of falls apart.
It does seem like those two ideas are kind of pulling in opposite directions. So for relative identity to work, would we need to somehow, I don't know, loosen the grip of Leibniz's law?
That's exactly what some philosophers who support relative identity propose. They suggest finding ways to restrict Leibniz's law so that it doesn't apply in every single
Okay,
case.
that makes sense. Because if everything had to share all properties for identity to be true, then relative identity wouldn't really have a leg to stand on. But restricting a fundamental law of logic seems like a pretty big deal.
It definitely is, and not many philosophers are willing to go that far. But what's interesting is that there are some examples of relations that are kind of similar to identity that seem to work just fine with a more restricted form of Leibniz's law. The article calls these congruence relations.
Congruence relations. Can you give me
Mhm.
an example? I don't think I've heard that term before.
Sure, think about numbers. If the difference between two integers is a multiple of 3, we can say they are congruent. And this congruence relation works just fine for operations like multiplication and addition.
Okay, I follow that. But wouldn't they still have to share all the same properties to be truly congruent?
Well, that's the key point. They don't. Take the numbers 2 and 11, for example. They're congruent based on our definition, right? Their difference is a multiple of 3. But 2 is even and 11 is odd. So they have some different properties, even though they're congruent.
Ah, I see. So they're the same in a specific way without being absolutely, totally identical.
Precisely. And you find other examples of congruence relations out in the world too. Think about speed. We say two objects are traveling at the same speed, even though they might be different colors, sizes, made of different stuff. They're the same in terms of speed without needing to be identical in all other ways.
So it's like a restricted kind of identity, focused just on that one aspect, like speed in this case.
Right. And this is what intrigues some philosophers about relative identity. It seems to offer a way to think about sameness and difference in a way that's more nuanced, more context dependent, without just throwing out the core principles of logic altogether.
It's definitely pushing us beyond that simple same versus different kind of thinking. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this all plays out in, real-world scenarios. The source mentioned some classic philosophical paradoxes that relative identity might shed some new light on, right?
It does, and those paradoxes really dig into these deep questions about, what it means for something to persist over time, how we handle change, all of that.
Well, let's get to those paradoxes then. I'm ready for my mind to be bent a little further.
So one of the paradoxes the source brings up is called the paradox of change. It's this idea of like, how can something change so much and still be considered the same thing?
Yeah, it's like, when you see a photo of yourself from like years ago and you think, man, that person looks totally different. That's still you somehow.
Exactly. And a classic example is, a dog as it ages. Like you have a picture of young Oscar, full of puppy energy. Then you have a picture of him years later, maybe a bit slower, a little gray around the muzzle. They look so different, but they're the same dog.
And that's where Leibniz's law, that idea that identical things have to share all the same properties, seems to run into trouble, right? Because the young dog and the old dog definitely have some different properties.
Right. And the standard account of identity, which relies on absolute identity, would say that because their properties are different, they can't be truly identical. But that feels wrong intuitively, doesn't it?
It does. It feels like there's something, about the essence of Oscar, something beyond just his appearance at a specific moment that makes it him throughout his life.
And that's where relative identity offers a different perspective. It says, yes, young Oscar and old Oscar are distinct in a way. They're different logical objects.
Wait, logical objects again. Can we unpack that a little more? It still feels a bit abstract to me.
Sure. Think of a logical object as like a specific way we're choosing to look at or categorize something. So young Oscar and old Oscar are different logical objects because we're, focusing on them at different points in time, like taking snapshots of a process. But they're still part of that same overarching process, the life of Oscar.
Okay, that helps. So we're not denying the differences, but we're also recognizing a deeper level of sameness, like different chapters in the same book.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And that's how relative identity helps us make sense of change. It lets us acknowledge the differences between those snapshots while still maintaining a core identity that persists.
So it gives us a framework for understanding how something can, like, evolve without completely losing its identity. That's really helpful, I think, because change is just, such a fundamental part of our experience in the world.
Absolutely. And the paradox of change is just one example of how relative identity can offer a fresh perspective on some of these, classic philosophical puzzles.
Okay, well, the source material mentioned a few other paradoxes, right? What's up next?
Well, next we have Chrysippus's paradox, which goes deep into the relationship between parts and wholes. And things get a little tricky here.
Right, bring on the trickiness. Let's do it.
So picture Oscar again. But this time we're going to introduce the concept of Oscar minus. It's kind of a thought experiment. Picture Oscar right now, but minus his tail. That's Oscar minus.
Okay, I'm picturing a slightly shorter, tailless Oscar.
Got it. Now, according to that standard account of identity, with its focus on absolute identity, Oscar and Oscar minus are distinct, even right now when Oscar still has his tail. And because identity is absolute, unchanging, they'll always be distinct.
I see where this is going. So when Oscar actually does lose his tail, what happens to Oscar minus? Does it suddenly become the same as Oscar? Do we then have like two distinct things in the same space?
That's the paradox. It seems logically impossible, right, for two totally separate things to be in the same space. But if we rigidly stick to absolute identity, that's where we end up.
So how does relative identity get us out of this mess?
Well, relative identity allows us to say that Oscar and Oscar minus are, both present, even after the tail incident. But they're not two separate physical beings. They're distinct in the sense of being different logical objects, but they're physically coincident.
So it's like they're two sides of the same coin, different concepts, but they can't really exist apart from each other.
Exactly. It's subtle but important. It allows for that conceptual difference, Oscar with a tail versus Oscar without a tail, while still recognizing that they're ultimately part of the same physical entity.
That helps. So relative identity gives us a way to talk about, parts and wholes without falling into those logical traps that the standard account seems to create.
Right. And this way of thinking about parts and wholes leads to another interesting paradox, the paradox of 101 Dalmatians.
Okay, so more dogs.
Yeah. And it really pushes how we think about counting and identity. Imagine you have a Dalmatian. You pluck a single hair from its coat. Is it still a Dalmatian?
Well, I mean, yeah, of course it's still a Dalmatian. One less hair doesn't change that.
But here's the paradox. If we accept that a Dalmatian minus one hair is still a Dalmatian, then logically we have to say that each individual hair on a Dalmatian makes a separate Dalmatian.
Because each time you take away a hair, you're creating a new entity that still fits the definition of Dalmatian, right?
Exactly. So instead of one Dalmatian, we suddenly have 101 or even thousands, depending on how many hairs we're counting.
That seems absurd, though. Like we're just multiplying dogs out of thin air.
Right. It really stretches our idea of what it means to be a single unified thing.
So how does relative identity handle this canine population explosion?
Relative identity says it's okay to acknowledge all those Dalmatian minus a hair entities as Dalmatians. They're all, in a way, distinct logical objects, but they're all part of that same Dalmatian. It's about recognizing different levels of analysis.
So, like saying a book is made of chapters, but it's still one book.
Mhm.
Or a body has many cells, but it's still one body.
Precisely. Relative identity allows us to hold both ideas, the individuality of the parts and the unity of the whole.
Okay, this is making more sense. We're shifting our view, right? Instead of getting stuck on the absolute identity of each tiny part, we're looking at the relationship to the bigger picture.
Hmm.
And that helps us avoid these, weird paradoxical conclusions.
Exactly. And the same kind of thinking can be applied to another classic puzzle, the paradox of constitution.
Ah, yes, this one's all about objects and the stuff they're made of,
Yeah.
right? Like a statue and the clay it's made from.
That's the one. Are they the same thing or two separate things? The standard account has a hard time with this.
Because if they were absolutely identical, you couldn't destroy one without destroying the other. But you can smash a statue without, making the clay disappear.
Right. And here's where relative identity comes in with a more nuanced view. It says the statue and the clay are, in a sense, the same, but only at a specific point in time.
But how can they be the same if they can, exist separately?
The key is understanding that terms like the clay or the statue, they're not fixed labels. They're what philosophers call non-rigid designators. Their reference can shift depending on, well, the context and the passage of time.
So the clay could refer to the statue when it's whole, and then to that lump of clay after it's smashed. Both of the clay, but in different ways.
Exactly. It's like the term the president. It refers to a different person over time.
Okay, so the names we use for these things don't have to have this absolute fixed reference that stays the same forever.
Precisely. And that helps us avoid that tricky problem of two distinct, unchanging things somehow occupying the same space.
It's like we're simplifying what exists by recognizing the relative nature of identity in these situations. Avoids a lot of philosophical headaches.
I like that simplifying what exists, and this idea of non-rigid designators and how it works with relative identity can be used in other cases too, like the relationship between a book and its copies.
Well, that's interesting. So instead of saying each copy is a separate thing from the original book, we could say they're all the same book in a relative sense.
Exactly. It's more streamlined. Fewer philosophical headaches, for sure.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the appeal of this relative identity approach. It seems like a really useful tool for, thinking through all these philosophical puzzles. But I'm wondering, how does it apply to, more subjective stuff? Beliefs, for example.
That's a great question. And the source material gets into that with a thought experiment called Church's Paradox. It brings up some really interesting questions about how our thoughts about identity can actually shape identity.
Okay, now that sounds pretty wild. I'm all ears. Tell me about Church's Paradox. Okay, so we've been talking about this whole relative identity thing and how it might help us, untangle some of those classic philosophical paradoxes. But I want to hear more about this Church's Paradox you mentioned, the one about beliefs and how they relate to identity.
Right, Church's Paradox, it really gets into some interesting territory. It makes us consider whether our thoughts about identity can actually, influence identity itself.
Okay, that already sounds like we're going pretty deep here. Break it down for me. What's the setup for this paradox?
Okay, so imagine a guy named Pierre who believes that London and Londres are two different cities. We know they're actually the same city, just different names in English and French. But Pierre, for whatever reason, truly believes they're different places.
So it's basically a case of mistaken identity. But how does that turn into a paradox?
Well, see, if we take Leibniz's law really strictly, that principle that says identical things have to have all the same properties, then we run into a problem. Because if Pierre believes London and Londres are different, and if we count his belief as a property, then, well, they have to be different for Leibniz's law to hold up.
Wait, hold on. Are we saying that just because someone believes something, it actually becomes true? That
Uh-huh.
seems like it could lead to some pretty messy situations.
Right. That's the paradoxical part. It's like we either have to restrict which beliefs count as properties for Leibniz's law, or we got to accept that our thoughts can somehow shape reality. And neither of those options are very satisfying, philosophically speaking.
Yeah, definitely not. So how does relative identity help us make sense of this whole situation?
Well, with relative identity, we can say that London and Londres are distinct objects, but only within Pierre's mind. They're different in the sense of being different objects of thought for him. But in reality, they're still the same city.
Okay, so we're acknowledging the difference in how Pierre sees things, but we're not like rewriting the map of the world just to fit his perspective.
Exactly. Relative identity lets us hold both those truths at the same time, the subjective experience of difference in Pierre's mind and the objective reality of the situation.
It's kind of like two people might interpret a painting differently, but it's still the same painting hanging on the wall.
That's a great way to put it. It shows how relative identity can handle those subjective experiences without forcing us into those extreme philosophical corners, like, saying reality is completely made up by our beliefs.
Right, we don't want to go there.
Mm.
So it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring all these different paradoxes, the paradox of change, Crispus's paradox, 101 Dalmatians, the paradox of constitution, and now Church's paradox. And it seems like relative identity offers a new way of looking at each of them.
It does. It gives us this more flexible, nuanced way to talk about identity, and it shows us that it's not always this absolute black and white concept.
But our source also talks a lot about absolute identity. It
Uh,
brings up this philosopher P.T. Geach, who argued that absolute identity doesn't even exist.
yeah, Geach took a really strong stance on that. He basically said the whole idea of absolute identity is an illusion, a product of, like, the way we use language.
Wow, that's a pretty big claim.
Yeah.
If everything is relative, what does that even mean for the concept of identity?
That's what we're going to dig into in this final part of our deep dive. We'll take a look at Geach's arguments, why he was so convinced about this relative view, and then we'll look at some of the counterarguments.
Okay, let's hear it then. Convince me that absolute identity is all just a big myth.
Well, one of Geach's main points was this idea that whenever we say something about identity, we always need what he called a completing predicate. We can't just say X is identical to Y. We got to say how they're identical.
So instead of like, this apple is identical to that apple, we'd say something like, this apple is identical to that apple because they're both fruits, or this apple is identical to that apple because they both grew on the same tree.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And Geacher argued that needing this completing predicate shows us that identity is always relative to some aspect or characteristic. It's never just this pure context-free sameness.
Okay, yeah, I see how that supports relative identity. It's like sameness always depends on how we're looking at things. It's always situated, you know?
Right. And Geach took this idea even further, saying that the ideology of a theory shapes how we understand identity. By ideology, he meant the set of concepts and predicates that a theory uses to describe the world.
So, like, the way we think about the world, the very language we use, actually influences how we see and define identity. Our tools shape the reality we're measuring.
That's exactly it. He was a big believer in what's called linguistic relativity, that idea that language doesn't just mirror reality, it actually helps create it.
Okay, so Geach is saying that absolute identity is basically a mirage, a trick of our language and how we categorize stuff.
You got it. He believed that anytime we try to talk about absolute identity, we're really just talking about some kind of relative identity in disguise.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing not everyone agreed with him, right?
Of course not. This sparked a whole lot of debate, as you can imagine, and there are some strong counter-arguments out there.
All right, well, let's hear them. What are some of the challenges to Geach's idea that absolute identity doesn't exist?
Well, one big objection is that this linguistic relativity thing doesn't automatically mean absolute identity can't exist. Just because language influences how we talk about identity doesn't mean there isn't some, like, deeper absolute kind of identity going on beneath the surface, independent of language.
It's like different cultures might have different words for snow, but it's still snow, no matter what you call it, right?
Agree. Precisely. And to support that point, Geach's critics often point to a distinction between indiscernibility and identity.
Remind me, what's the difference there? They seem pretty similar.
Indiscernibility means two things share all their observable properties. They look the same, act the same. As far as we can tell, they're basically twins. But identity, that's a deeper relationship. Things can be indiscernible without being truly identical.
So two coins fresh out of the mint might be indiscernible to us, but they're still two separate coins.
That's right. And this difference matters because even if language only lets us see indiscernibility, it doesn't mean absolute identity isn't happening on a level our language just can't quite grasp.
I see. It's like acknowledging the limits of, human perception and our language. Just because we can't directly see something doesn't mean it's not there.
Exactly. And another argument against Geach uses these really cool mathematical things called quotient structures. They give us a way to hold on to absolute identity, even when we're dealing with equivalence relations, which are the kinds of relationships that relative identity focuses on.
Okay, quotient structures. That sounds a little intimidating. Can you break that down for me?
Sure. Think back to that example with numbers being congruent if their difference is a multiple of 3. A quotient structure would basically group all the numbers congruent to each other into one single thing.
So like all the numbers that leave a remainder of 1 when divided by 3 get bundled together, all the numbers with a remainder of 2 get bundled together, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And within each of those bundles, within those groups of congruent numbers, absolute identity would still hold true. So even though we're dealing with an equivalence like congruence, we haven't actually lost absolute identity. It's just working on a different level.
Oh, that's pretty neat. So it's like we're creating these like higher level entities, super numbers or something, where absolute identity can still exist.
That's a great way to think about it. So even if Geach is right that our everyday language tends to use relative identity, these quotient structures show that absolute identity isn't necessarily incompatible with equivalence relations.
Okay, so Geach's attempt to completely get rid of absolute identity might have been a little premature.
That's what some philosophers say. And one last thing to think about is that a shift in ideology, in Geach's sense, doesn't always fully explain our intuition about relative identity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about the paradox of change we discussed. Even if we change the way we talk about young Oscar and old Oscar, describing them as like temporal parts of a larger whole, we still have this intuitive sense that they're the same dog, right?
We do. It's like, yeah, we might be using different words, but the underlying relationship, that feeling of continuity, it still feels real.
Right. So while language is definitely part of how we think about identity, it might not be the whole story. There might be something deeper going on that points to, the truth of relative identity, even when we try to frame things in terms of absolute identity.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole relative identity concept now. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, why should anyone care about this? What are the broader implications of this idea?
It's a great question. It might seem very abstract and philosophical, but it actually has some pretty significant consequences for how we think about the world.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one, relative identity has big implications for ontology. That's the study of what exists. If identity isn't always absolute, if it can change depending on the context, it really challenges our ideas about the basic building blocks of reality.
We're questioning what it even means for something to exist if its identity is fluid and depends on how we look at it, right?
Exactly. And these big ontological questions have practical effects, too. Remember those examples, statues and clay, books and copies? Relative identity helps us avoid some unnecessary baggage in those cases. It lets us simplify what we think exists without sacrificing accuracy.
Like we're streamlining our ontology, making it more elegant, less clutter.
Exactly. And beyond ontology, relative identity impacts how we think about change, how things last over time, and even our own sense of self as we change. It forces us to acknowledge how complex things really are, that things aren't always as fixed and unchanging as we might assume.
So it's not just an abstract thought experiment. It actually changes how we see ourselves in a relationship to the world.
Absolutely. And that's what makes philosophy so engaging and relevant. It challenges our assumptions, makes us think critically, and, ultimately it opens up new ways of understanding the universe and our place in it.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how something as basic as identity can lead to such profound philosophical questions.
And really, we've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore within relative identity. But hopefully, this has gotten you curious and inspired you to, you know, do your own research, read the source material, and see where your own philosophical journey takes you. Who knows? You might discover something new about identity, reality, the whole shebang.